Hello, everyone. Welcome to Live from the Ranch. A very good morning to you, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Ken. This is Live from the Ranch, and my co-host this month, as every month. Uh-oh, I'm getting some feedback here. What does that mean? I know what it means. All right.
You're back. You sound good
I'm
now.
back. Hi, I was just about to introduce you. I realized I had a video link open, and I was hearing myself on super long delay. Well, Juliana, how are you? Welcome. I'm glad to see you again for this month's episode of Live from the Ranch.
Oh my gosh, Ken, it feels like there's been so many lifetimes since the last time I saw you in Portland for Clicker Expo.
Well, it's so true. In fact, one of the things that I'm going to talk to Susan about is that right after Clicker Expo, I went to the International Marine Animal Trainers Association conference. And then from there, I went to the Animal Behavior Managers Alliance conference, which is what brought up so many percolating and interesting topics that I want to talk to Susan about, because often Susan and I, when we get together, start thinking about topics and talking about different ways of looking at them. And I learn a lot, crystallizes a lot for me. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. So I'm going to encourage everybody who's watching today, if you have questions for Susan or me, to please put them in the chat window. Juliana is going to be paying attention to those, and at some point we will bring some of your questions to Susan and myself, and we'll have a great discussion about anything and everything as it relates to the variety of topics we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I thought what I would do is sort of quickly give everybody a little reminder that we have our Karen Pryor Academy. You can build your skills and knowledge by enrolling in any of our preparatory dog trainer courses, or if you already have experience, apply to our professional certification program. You can see right there on the screen at least 4 of the locations that are coming up in the very near future. But we have well over 25 locations and opportunities to become a certified dog trainer. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, please go to KarenPryorAcademy.com. And with having said that, I want to jump right into this episode today. And you often hear people say that this person needs no introduction. And while I believe that to be the case with Susan, who's been on the program with me several times in the past, I am going to give you a little introduction to her, just in the off chance you have missed the information somewhere along the way of who Susan is. She is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychology at Utah State University. She's co-authored chapters on behavior change in 5 veterinary texts. Her popular articles have been translated into 17 languages. And Susan teaches seminars and courses on animal learning online. Her probably best known course is How Behavior Works, also known as Living and Learning with Animals, or LLA. And she's been reaching students from last count up to 60 different countries from all over the world. She consults with zoos and animal organizations around the world. She is a regular contributor to Clicker Expo. I consider her a good friend and colleague. Susan, welcome to Live from the Ranch. How are you, Susan?
Hi, I'm excited to have any number of minutes with you, and I'm so impressed that you actually knew what the acronyms for ABMA and IMATA meant off the top of your, because I'm constantly screwing that up. So I'm so happy to be here, and what a great crowd of people.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people joining us today. And, one of the things that prompted me to want to talk to you is because of the fact that we were together at Clicker Expo, like Juliana was just mentioning. And then I literally left Clicker Expo and went to the International Marine Animal Trainers Association conference. And then I left there and went to ABMA, which is the Animal Behavior Managers Alliance. And there were these themes that kept popping up. And I thought, gosh, this would be a good conversation to have with Susan. The subject of choice and control comes up all the time. Recent hubbub about LIMA and what it means kept coming up. And then the other one that came up a lot was negative reinforcement. And I think that one came up for a couple of different reasons. I think that I recently did a podcast with Gray Stafford from Zoologic, the Zoologic podcast, and I've been on that podcast several times. And he wanted to get my take on negative reinforcement because he has seen in many, many, many circles that that the talk of negative reinforcement in the positive reinforcement community has become more prevalent and has become far more common for people to ask about its use than Gray remembered it being 20 years ago when we didn't talk about it much at all. And I was curious first if you had any insight. I mean, I certainly have my own opinions about why it's come up more recently, but have you noticed that conversation coming up more often in your circles?
Absolutely. And it makes sense because as we've moved down the journey of less intrusive procedures that are also effective, we join up with the philosophy and the practice of allowing animals to say no. And even the word allow gets my little hairs on the back of my neck up a little bit from third grade, is who are you to allow me to do anything? But for lack of a better, more sensitive language to talk about behavior with, I think that's where it intersects, is that we've learned to use less and less intrusive procedures without compromising effectiveness. And that leads us to giving animals more choice about saying yes and no. And whenever an animal says no, that's a form of negative reinforcement. They say no more to remove whatever it is they're saying no to.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think comes up a lot is first, I think there's confusion as to what negative reinforcement means, and I think it's a pendulum swing. Is that for a long time everyone is just positive reinforcement, and then a lot of positive reinforcement trainers realized that negative reinforcement could be the least intrusive option and it could be a good choice. And all of a sudden, the pendulum swung that direction with going, oh, yes, we should use it. But I still tend to say, yes, there are times when it is the best choice, but I would still caution people about its use. But maybe for those that are new to the concept of negative reinforcement, how would you describe it simply to somebody who's new to that concept?
Yeah, it's one of our jarring jargon terms that doesn't fit well with plain English. But in the science of behavior change, the terminology most of us are committing to talking through, talking with, it simply means reinforcement. That is a consequence that strengthens the behavior that occurs before the consequence, a consequence that increases behavior, so it's reinforcement, through the process of escape or avoidance by removing something aversive. So if we think about a snake on the path is an example I use. When we see the snake on our hiking path and we escape it by backing up and going a different way, that's an example of backing up more to create distance or negative subtraction of that snake from us. And then if we don't hike in that area again, that's avoidance. We avoid more by going somewhere else so as to not meet that snake again. So it's a very common behavior schedule of reinforcement that we do something more to escape or avoid something we don't like.
And I think one of the examples that I use a lot also is where I see it come up often is in the shelter world when we're dealing with dogs that are very fearful. They're very fearful of people. Oftentimes, the best thing we can do is back away and give them some space, and that is a very reinforcing thing for them. And I see the same thing sometimes in with zoological animals when we're dealing with an animal that's just been rescued or rehabilitated from somewhere and they're not comfortable with people. Our presence is not very reinforcing, and oftentimes backing away and giving them space really helps, and that's the use of negative reinforcement. I'm curious as someone who teaches people about these concepts, you and I tend to teach similar groups of people, but with different perspectives. In other words, I tend to teach a lot about practical uses and applied applications. And you talk about those things as well. And do you see the risk in not talk in people using negative reinforcement and thinking of it as being this wonderful tool and perhaps overusing it or not realizing where the risks lie?
I absolutely do, and I call that negative reinforcement creep. Any of these procedures that have aversive stimuli, aversive events or conditions involved, it's very easy for us to kind of creep into using them more coercively
Right.
than we originally intended. And so when an animal says no, you can either move away to reinforce the no behavior, or you can start to pressure that animal. And I think that that's one of the things we need a lot of community watch on with each other, is when does using negative reinforcement or negative punishment
Right.
for that matter, right? When does it start to creep into more coercive than we need? And I think that's one of the keys that helps me figure that out, is what is necessary. And if I ask that question, is it necessary to use negative reinforcement to honor the no? Then I use it. But if it's not necessary, if I can use a less intrusive or controlling approach, then I'm ethically bound to do that.
Right.
So the is it necessary key, I think, is very valuable.
Yeah, and I think the example that I come into contact with myself a lot is here at the ranch. We have our alpacas, and our alpacas have come to be very calm and comfortable around us. But when we acquired them from a meat ranch, and their only association with people was being herded from place to place. In other words, we need you to move over there, so the people would come in and cause them to move where they wanted them to go, but it was
Right.
reinforced negatively. It was the pressure. And I believe often when I've seen those kind of work situations, they often don't even try to use a positive approach. They just simply assume we've got to force them, and and depending upon the individual, it can be really, really aversive. So much so that when the animals came here, their only association with people was running away from them. That's what they're supposed to do when they see people. And so building up that trust took a long time. And I always do worry about that creep that you're talking about, that, um, oh, this works. Let me do it faster. Let me do it harsher. Let me do it with more intensity. And maybe that'll get them to move even faster. And it just becomes this normal that often the user isn't even thinking about it being a harsh or overtly aversive thing.
Yeah. And so if we go back to that definition again, the alpacas run away more in order to subtract proximity to you, R minus. And yeah, it's not enough to just observe that animals have a right to say no, that those alpacas um, are benefit from the freedom to run away. We also then have to bring our knowledge of the science and our skills to bear to ask, how can we get them to yes?
Right.
So we do both at the same time. And I think that when you have negative reinforcement creep or aversive stimulation creep, you forget to ask, is it necessary? And you forget to ask, how can I get them to yes? And
Yes.
that's, of course, our biggest contribution as positive reinforcement based and science based trainers, is we know how to get animals to yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to ask about, which get your thoughts on, because I know you have plenty of those, is you developed and introduced to the training community back in 2008 the hierarchy of effective behavior change procedures, which came from an article you wrote about effectiveness is not enough, or what's wrong with this picture, effectiveness is not enough. And
Right.
in your hierarchy, uh, negative reinforcement is fairly high on the hierarchy, meaning you don't use that unless you absolutely need to. And I know that there's a lot of people who have differing opinions as to how high up on the hierarchy it should be or how low in the hierarchy it should be. People who find it useful feel it should be lower, and people who find it too intrusive wish it was higher. And I maybe we could take a look at a graphic representation of the hierarchy. We have one here that I'll put up on the screen here. And this is, not everyone may have seen this version, right, Susan? This is one that you just came out with 2023. And what I like about it is that when you get to extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment, which is up at exit number 5 on your hierarchy, the road becomes really curvy, indicating the risks you need to be aware of before you use these techniques. And I love the fact that you moved the crash barrier, which used to be all the way at the top of the hierarchy. You moved it before the positive punishment exit, which really makes people realize there's risks to doing this. How do you explain your decision or your thinking about where you place these things on the hierarchy?
Well, this was meant to be really just a process, think aloud piece for people rather than just acting. You know, we all have such fluency with punishment because of the way force and coercion, because of the way we were raised, because our society has used those strategies for eons,
Right.
that it becomes quite a default for many of us to just go there, you know, tap the animal, push its butt down on a sit, or, you know, take the kid by the hand and drag him down the aisle. And so what I was hoping to do was following the least intrusive principle, which is a guideline in special education, which you know was my first 20 years of work, to shed light on how can we stop and think about not only being effective, but the process by which we're effective. Can I be effective with health and well-being solutions? Can I be effective with antecedent arrangement? Can I be effective with positive reinforcement? So the idea is to say to yourself, before I act and react, I think about how can I step up and ask this question, can I be effective and less intrusive than my reactions? Because I know, for example, Adrian's here in the companion parrot world where we first met 25 years ago. It was all about dropping birds if they bit you, forcing them onto your hand, grabbing them by the bodies and pulling them out and passing them around. I mean, we came from such, in the animal world and the kid world, came from so much force and coercion, unnecessary force and coercion, that represented our legacy, our history as learners, not our best use of the science. So by writing it out in that hierarchy, what I'm suggesting is think about this one first. No? Okay. Think about the next one. No? Why not? Okay. Think about the next one. And at no time should our lack of skill or lack of familiarity with a less intrusive procedure give us the rationale for being more coercive or more forceful. If we don't have the skill to do it with positive reinforcement, how many times have I called you this year just to talk about sea lions, you know? So if you don't know how to do it with less intrusiveness, then you find someone who you know does do it with less intrusiveness, and they get to coach you to be the person who helps you learn how to do it. So we don't want our lack of skill to be the reason why we're pushing animals around.
Right. And I would say another thing that I think is valuable, I think your hierarchy is a wonderful guideline to follow, but it's just that it's a set of guidelines that are asking you questions, making you think. They aren't absolute rules that everybody should follow precisely in that order.
And yet, I've learned from your model, that's correct, absolutely. But if you were to ask me, how would I start teaching and coaching a beginner in teaching or animal training? I would say to have them follow that hierarchy lockstep, talk it through with their coach, their supervisors, because they don't have enough information and experience yet to rearrange things situationally or based on the individual learner. Whereas when you and I talk about it, when do we use negative reinforcement? that's a whole different story of experience and shared judgment calls and effectiveness than beginners. So it was really Joe Lang who I think pointed this out best, that while on the one hand, we want people to be so expert at applying the teaching principles and practices to whoever their learners are, that they can draft a new blank slate development of programs that are highly attuned and custom fit. When we're bringing up beginners, which is essentially a whole society of people, then it makes sense to give them less latitude of personal choice until they demonstrate those skills. And I know that that's how you bring newcomers in as well.
Absolutely. That was one of the things that I talked with Grace Stafford about when I talked about negative reinforcement, is that I really push my learners, if they're new, to the lower end of the hierarchy and say, you don't want to go here. And if that's the only option available to you, you ought to look for other people to help you, because I think that's going to be valuable to you. I think the skill, you need skill level to be able to determine some of those things. I'm going to ask, normally we would go to a break, but before we go to a break, I'm going to ask if Juliana can join us. And then I also wanted to point out to everybody that we put a link in the chat window to the behaviorworks.org website, which is Susan's website, where there are so many excellent resources there. And Juliana, I'm thinking of taking this in another direction after we come back from break. And I thought I would check and see if you had any questions, or if our guests had any questions for Susan about the topic of negative reinforcement.
Yeah, there's a great question in the chat. And before that, Susan, you've said a few times here, asking yourself the question of, is it necessary? Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like? What's some criteria for you to decide if something is in fact necessary?
Simply, it means that positive reinforcement done well will not produce effectiveness. So is it necessary to go up the scale of increased force and coercion? Or in expert hands, would positive reinforcement, antecedent arrangement, and appropriate well-being, nutrition, health, physical setting be enough? So yeah, and I think to give it a little bit more of what that might look like, Juliana, is if an animal takes, I'm thinking of our zoo work, Ken, if an animal takes food from a trainer, whether it's from the hand or through a PVC chute or tossed, that to me is one of the brightest examples of testing whether or not leaving positive reinforcement is necessary. It's when an animal doesn't take food or other reinforcers, when I have no reinforcer delivery system, that I start to think about working on giving them the power to say no, hoping that then they learn to come closer to get to the yes. But that's my biggest test for what's necessary, is can I get reinforcers to them? And if I can't, that's when I start to consider what to do about it, how to get to the yes.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful additional information. So Samantha has a really great question. Can you explain when and how the use of negative reinforcement to reward smaller and smaller tells starts leaning or creeping into the negative punishment quadrant, i.e. withholding for stillness or acceptance before removing the aversive?
Wow. Like from my brain to your question, this is something that has me a little bit concerned. First of all, I have to say again how thrilled I am. I know almost everybody's name on this list of awesome community members. So you have really created an incredible community of Live at the Ranch. It's very exciting to see everyone. So to get to this great question, because I spent a lot of time working this through, I don't think, and I would say that many of us don't think, that waiting for an animal to do a desirable behavior in order to move away for the negative reinforcement function is the right way to use negative reinforcement to give animals the voice to say no. What rather I advocate, and I know, again, I mentioned Joe Lang because he sort of dusted off this whole discussion, and Ken Ramirez and I have talked about this as well. I guess I don't need to use your last name because there's no other Ken on the picture with me. Susan Friedman, Ken Ramirez. That the idea is to observe the animal giving you an uncomfortable behavior. And I don't think we need 82 different emotion words, from Plutchik's psycho-emotional wheel to describe it. Just comfortable or uncomfortable. If we see an animal giving us behavior that is uncomfortable, then we can step back. The question is when to come forward again. And I think what we do is come forward only to the point at which the animal remains comfortable.
Right.
If we've gotten too close so that the animal shows uncomfortable behavior again, some people will wait till they show comfortable behavior before they reinforce it with stepping back. I say that's an error. I mean, that's a pretty big statement there. I think that's not the best way to use this program. I think that if you move too close, such that the animal is showing uncomfortable behavior or increases their discomfort, that you back away immediately and you don't make that mistake again. So it always makes me think about Bob Bailey saying, you've made a mistake, go bang your head 3 times on the wall. I don't go that far because I really am positive based, but what I want people to do is be comfortable saying, I went too far, my mistake. I apologize, giraffe, I'm backing up, and I won't get that close again. So I think that that's a really important question to ask. When you use the say no protocol and you reinforce the no behavior by stepping away, we come back, but only sub-threshold, I think dog trainers would call it. And if by mistake you do trigger that, you back away anyway, and you don't make the same mistake twice.
Yeah. And I would say it's not that you never would go back to that place again, but you wouldn't go back to that place again until the animal showed you that they were ready.
Oh, right. I mean, eventually you'll have to cross that line, but you come back, and thanks for that prompt, really, because what we do in the Behavior Works team is we say, you come back, but you come back differently. You don't keep doing the same thing over and over again. So this notion is one of the keys, is do it again, but differently. So maybe you slice how close you go. Maybe you go a little bit to the side. Maybe you keep your hands behind your back. This notion of charging the animal the cost of us repeating the same failed attempts, it hurts relationships and it takes a lot of time.
It does. It absolutely does. Hey, you know what? I want to continue down this path a little bit. It's interesting as we started talking about these ideas. One of the big controversies that I've heard a lot about recently has been this idea of LIMA and what we as a community should do with LIMA. So I'm going to give all of us just a 60-second break, and I'm going to just quickly talk a little bit about your visit coming up to the ranch, Susan, and maybe we can talk about that as well, and then we'll talk about LIMA. So just want everybody to be aware that Susan is going to be joining me here at the ranch in Graham, Washington, August 24th and 25th for a hands-on workshop that we call The Magic is in the Data. We first did this workshop together a couple of years ago, and it was very, very popular. It sold out at the time. So we brought it back once again, and it's a really great opportunity for Susan and I to talk about data, the importance of data, and for us to illustrate how we use it by actually going out and working with the animals, taking data, coming back and making some decisions about what we're going to do for the next training approximation or the next enrichment session, etc. So you can learn a lot more about that at theranch.clickertraining.com. I just wanted to take advantage of you being on the screen for us to talk a little bit about that. I am looking forward to seeing you out in August, and I felt like the class went really well a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we did is, I would go out and we set a training goal with one of my animals. I went out and trained. Everybody took data. We talked about what we could do to improve the results, and so we did the same thing with enrichment, and so I think that'll be a lot of fun for us to revisit that again. We've got a lot of people signing up for it, so looking
Okay.
forward. So before we went to break, I was talking about we talked about the hierarchy, and then we talked a little bit about negative reinforcement and where it fit in and what is the best way to use it. And that just reminded me that one of the things that kept coming up throughout my travels this past month was LIMA. And for those that might be listening that maybe don't know what LIMA is, that it's referred to as the least intrusive, minimally aversive principle. And it was a principle that was introduced by that name, LIMA, by Stephen Lindsay in 2005. And in his introduction of LIMA, he did talk about using the least intrusive principle, and a lot of people sort of surrounded that idea and goes, "That's a great idea. That's what we should be doing as positive reinforcers." But then Stephen Lindsay used it as justification for why, in certain situations, he felt that prong collar or a shock collar should be used. And so there's been a lot of controversy in the last year about whether or not LIMA is a principle that we should be adhering to. And just for those listening in, at Karen Pryor Academy, we have taken LIMA out of our code of conduct simply because within our program, we don't really teach LIMA. We tend to use the hierarchy of effective procedures that you've put out as an example of one tool we use when making ethical decision making. But what is your take on the controversy as it's been surrounding? I know that you heard a lot about it when we were at Expo, but I'm just curious as to your take on the controversy and the whole idea of LIMA.
Yeah, I think a slightly different, or I have a few different ways of thinking about it, and I haven't landed on just one way of thinking about this issue that's arrived. I don't know if anybody else here has been raised by a mom who always said, cut the dramatics, but I am the walking vision of a cut the dramatics background. And so I tend to stay calm and say, oh, this is interesting. It's my job to take a look at reveals, new information, and to decide whether or not the new information is just new or whether it really leads us to do what we do better. And then I have to be aware of what I mean by better. What does better look like? So it's really a big conversation. One point of view that I hold of many minds is that LIMA, least intrusive, minimally aversive, which was always very different than my writing about least intrusive principles and the hierarchy, is just 4 words, right? In plain English, as one of our great leaders, Ogden Lindsley, said, in plain English, those 4 words have meaning to us that keeps us using more positive reinforcement and less force and coercion. So when I think about just those 4 words, that nobody owns the words, and they do have a plain English meaning, I'm comfortable with continuing to use it as long as we describe what we mean by those 4 words. All of us are used to having a single word have multiple meanings depending on who the speaker is. And that's why we do the unlabel me thing and say, what does it look like? Because dominant has different meanings to different people. So I don't especially have a huge problem with us hearing those 4 plain English words and making a meaning that is useful to us for modern day guidelines. So part of me says, just operationalize what we mean by it and go forward and do good things, The other thing is, I think that affiliation tends to be such a strong reinforcer for humans. Having a posse, a tribe, a culture, that we tend to gravitate towards the pile-on opportunities. We hear something new and we all pile that way. And then in 5 years, we hear something else and we all pile in the other way. And one of the things that I hope to give to all of you is a reasoned voice that resists the pile-on. And so I went back and I read what Stephen Lindsay wrote about his operational definition, his observable definition of those 4 plain English words. And what I found was, although he does clearly talk about aversive tools like prong collars and so forth as viable tools to be in the toolkit of any experienced dog trainer, he also goes to great lengths to talk about aversive creep, punishment creep, aversive tool creep. And so I just wrote down on page 725, where he says aversive procedures are legitimate and valuable tools for controlling undesirable behavior. I hear that and the breath just goes out of my lungs. But when I keep reading, he says, but in the same sentence, but such techniques can be rapidly debauched into a form that substantially complicates matters. And then he goes on to talk about the fallout of punishment. So while I disagree that our operationalization of those 4 plain English words should say that we think that these are legitimate in value in controlling undesirable behaviors, I would replace that with saying when it's necessary, which should be very rare.
Right.
I also just want to point out that he also spends many pages talking about not using those tools without very careful consideration, because used without consideration will produce, he writes, many more problems than the original behavior. So I want to just have everybody come a little bit more to center from that rushing over to the side and evaluate introspectively what's your reinforcer for being up in arms instead of just getting curious. What did Lindsay say?
I love that approach. And to me, it's also very similar to the approach we were talking about with negative reinforcement. It would be foolish for me as a trainer to say, I will never, ever use punishment, because we know that punishment exists in the world and it happens and it's going to be there. And I have to be aware of that. But that's different than saying to a learner, I really encourage you to avoid the use of punishers. It's important that you understand that punishment has fallout and that there are challenges. And so don't go there unless you really, really have to. And in my opinion, you shouldn't have to very often. And I very much dislike the whole piling on thing, as opposed to the, this is an interesting discussion. What do you think about it? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you about it, because I knew that you would take this measured approach as opposed to, I'm going to go jump on that bandwagon, because I think that's risky. It's risky to jump on any bandwagon without thinking about it, without really saying, well, what does that really mean? And what are we suggesting? And what does that mean for us? And how do I operationalize those very terms? So
right. So we can choose not to use it, but let's choose to not use it for reasons that will stand the test of time. I mean, one of the things that we've discussed about how to select new ideas and conceptualizations versus letting them float by is, will they stand the test of time?
Right.
And it's surprising to me how well the hierarchy graphic has stood the test of time. I'm always on the balls of my feet, ready to revise. But when you've got, someone as auspicious as Gene Donaldson saying negative reinforcement should be up with positive punishment, make that change, Friedman, on the one hand, but you've got Jesus Rosales Ruiz saying, bring negative reinforcement down to positive reinforcement On the other hand, I'm like, let's just see how more information, more growth in our field, more science to inform us plays out before we rush to make any changes.
Right.
So that's where I'm at with it.
No, I appreciate that perspective. I think it's a great one. And I think it's important to point out when you're talking about the hierarchy of behavior change procedures that we just looked at that you created, that isn't a graphic representation of LIMA. LIMA is a different thing altogether, right?
It is. It is. And when I've told you this story, it's I always say, and I have the emails, as though somebody doesn't believe me, you know, and I've never had anybody not believe me, but I'm always caught, maybe it's my New York background. When it was Margie Alonso who first asked if IAABC could use the hierarchy graphic, and they were going to attach it to the LIMA conceptualization. And I explained to her then that I had not heard of LIMA until I started working with dog trainers, that the least intrusive principle was my introduction to this concept of where on the continuum of coercion can we advocate people field-wide land. We want them to land closer to positive reinforcement, further away from positive punishment. And so I didn't see the two as, you know, those two concepts didn't get linked together until the organizations tried to do a wonderful thing, which is to say, let's boot ourselves out of our punishment legacy and into a new age. And here are some tools that we can do it with. But that doesn't mean that the tools are go without revision. You know, that performance feedback revision loop that we all use every day to stay successful applies to everything we write, everything we advocate for. We've got to get comfortable with revision.
Yeah, and one of the things that you just pointed out is that as you developed your hierarchy of effective behavior change procedures, you looked at the least intrusive principle, which is actually, I've heard you talk about that the least intrusive principle is actually a common principle that you find in many different professions in many different areas. Isn't that right?
Yes, and that's, I think, the biggest reason to stick with it, to keep it up top. Doesn't have to be the only guideline, but I think it's important that it be at least one of the influential ones that we teach newcomers, you know, to use, is because it is not just my own conceptualization, you know, with my brilliant mind I came up with, Lisa, you know, not at all.
Right.
It is the ethical principle in law enforcement. We know what that looks like when that fails. In biology, in special education, the least intrusive principle for me is thrilling because it's an opportunity to shake hands with all these other helping professions or people interactive professions. And it keeps all of us on the lower end of coercion. So, you know, we want to make sure that Tylenol doesn't work before a doctor prescribes Tylenol with codeine.
Right.
And if I were to say least intrusive to the medical profession, they would know that that's part of their hallmark ethical standard.
Right.
So to give up something that, because it's not idiosyncratic to dog training, because it's part of the common ethical standard across professions, is one of the most attractive reasons for keeping it in play.
Good. Hey, I want to take another break, but before I do, I thought I would see if Juliana wants to jump in just to see. Sometimes she has another perspective or might have a question. You don't have to ask a question, Juliana, but I thought I'd check in with you before we change topics.
Susan, I will say that this is the most convincing argument I've heard to keep LIMA sticking around, because not that I've jumped on the bandwagon to say, you know, like no LIMA ever again, but there's been a huge frustration for me that it has essentially feels like it has been co-opted for totally what it wasn't originally intended to be used as. It's extremely frustrating. And so, of course, your voice of reason is
we want to be careful. Yeah, move slow, think hard, and then chop off whatever we need to chop. I mean, we chop positive punishment off.
Move slow, think hard is really like the antithesis of like the culture these days, or at least the
I
energy.
know.
Ken, what were you saying?
No, I was going to say, I think one of the things that I wanted to point out, if I wanted to make sure and distinguish, is that when Susan, when you talk about the least intrusive principle, that's different than LIMA. LIMA uses the least intrusive principle, as does your hierarchy of effective behavior change procedures, as do many other things. The least intrusive principle is this more overriding principle
That's right.
that LIMA is a part of, that many things are a part of. They're just not necessarily one and the same.
And that's part of its value to me. When we can look at people in other professions that influence behavior, from police officers to surgeons, and rely on the same ethical or similar ethical standard, that's moving a society in a direction. And that's pretty thrilling.
That sounds very reinforcing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, great. Well, I'm going to take a short 60-second break again, and then I'm going to come back to you, Susan, with a slight change in topic. I want to remind everybody that at KPA, we do have a group of classes that we all call KPA Live. These are classes that are usually 4 weeks long. They take place on Zoom. They have a video-based curriculum that guides you each week, and then an online discussion group, as well as live coaching taking place during those courses. These have been very popular this past year, and we have a whole new slate of those classes coming up this year as well. So check out those classes at KarenPryorAcademy.com. I'll be teaching a course myself a little bit later on in the year in that live class format. So, Susan, it's amazing to me how quickly time goes by. And we're like into the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time today. But all of these things sort of, in many ways, can get grouped under the category of giving the animals more control over their over outcomes, over their behavior. And that concept of choice and control is probably one that for the last 4 or 5 years, in the work that I do with zoos and the work that I do with working dogs, gives people the most angst, because they feel like their jobs require them to get this particular task trained. And the idea of giving your dog or your animal choice, they worry is going to cause them to, the animal to choose not to want to perform. And so I'm curious, do you get that kind of question? I can't be the only one who's constantly challenged with that question.
You're not. And it's so great when we sort of meet up on the same issues together, because it's double brain power. Just the other day, someone from a zoo said to me, "We're giving the animal choice. The animal said no. So we ended the training session. We keep ending the training session." And that was really good feedback for me, that I have not yet explained or written carefully what we mean about giving animals the right to say no. And now I'm saying it this way: every animal has a right to say no, and you need the skills to get to the yes. So getting them from no to yes is not just something that happens while they're thinking about the day in their enclosure.
Right.
It happens because of what we skilled trainers do to make saying yes to the things we ask of them more reinforcing. And so that opens up like just a fireworks full of great procedures about how to teach animals that working with us is in their favor.
Yeah. And a big part of that is finding a way to make the learning enjoyable, make the learning really, really, really reinforcing, because it's understandable that if you start, often what happens is a working dog starts them at too high a level of skill
That's
that
right.
the dog needs, and the dog is not succeeding, and the dog is saying no. And if all the trainer is going to do is stop the training and then start all over in the same place again tomorrow, that's a recipe for disaster. I think that information that the animal's giving you, that this is too hard, means I, as a trainer, need to rethink my training plan. I need to show them how to do it, make it easier for them to do it, make it more reinforcing for them to do it, so that the answer is yes. And I love the way you say turning that no into a yes. It isn't necessarily about the animal just is going
Saying yes.
Yes, you have to show them why and how
Right.
to get to that yes.
Well, I have just the other day, you and I teach so much and talk so much to so many brilliant people that insights and ideas that shape the way we teach, it's constantly moving. It's constantly moving. And one of the ones just the other day that I've been working on with Rick Hester and Amy Shills, two of the Behavior Works consultants, is this idea of inertia versus momentum. So
Mhm.
many of our training procedures inadvertently produce inertia. So the animal says no, we just stop training. We put too much reinforcement history on one approximation, the animal gets stuck on that approximation. We narrow variability down, we don't get enough to move forward. All of these different things we're listing out now that inadvertently produce, there it is, my fireworks metaphor. Everything that, so many things we do inadvertently produce inertia when what we should be expert at is producing momentum. So when an animal says no, if we see that as inertia, what are we going to do differently to get momentum? So Amy called the other day, she's working with a giraffe, and this giraffe's just not moving forward. So I said to her, I'm going to give you back what you taught me. Do something differently. Get momentum. So she dropped the goal and she just started targeting, moving, reinforcing, built up that momentum, which of course was the researcher Tony Nevin's huge contribution. And so the science is there as well. But what does it look like when we're training? After she just played with behavior and reinforcement, the animal very enthusiastically came up and then she could move from there. So this idea might be helpful to others.
Well,
When an animal says no, that's inertia. They don't want to move forward. How can we give them movement to get them to the yes? Do something different.
yeah, that is it's such an important way of looking at it. And I know that I constantly, as I work with organizations who want to embrace positive reinforcement, and because the idea of giving them choice and giving them more control is such a big, when I say recent topic in the positive reinforcement community, I mean the last decade or so. You've heard about it more and more and more. I see these people in the working animal environments going, but I don't know how to do that. And I think for me, it's really about really re-looking at what you're doing and finding a way to make it more reinforcing, to, like you say,
To
change the way
move,
you approach it, change the way the approximations you're using, change the environment in some way,
reinforcer,
or the
change the
reinforcer in some
reinforcer.
way, so that you can get there. And I think we have a lot of examples in the working animal world where animals are given choice and are given the option to opt out, and they don't opt out very often, but it's because reinforcers are so good, and because they don't even think of saying no anymore because they have been reinforced so well throughout that learning process.
And that was part of the insight when this person said this to me. What I realized was they were thinking of choice as living inside the animal.
Right.
So the animal says no, and that's something inside the animal's body. How are we going to change what's in their body? But let's remember that choice is not inside the animal. Choice is inside the animal's behavioral history. It's inside everything they've learned about working with humans up to this moment. So their choice today is a reflection of their past experience.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
on the basis of experience, predicting what's going to happen if I say yes, that the animal chooses to say no. Once you remember that choice is not a property or a state of an animal, it's the result of, I'm reinforcing myself. I'll put my hands down. It's the result of their past history of reinforcement and punishment, hanging around with humans. We change their choice by changing their history with us, their experience with us. And I think that's the logical flaw in people's thinking, that choice lives inside the animal like their eye color, but it's a result of their history. We change history all the time with current conditions.
Right. I'm going to ask Juliana to join us because, again, I like to give her an opportunity to chime in or to ask questions if the guests are asking questions. But I want to share my own personal experience story with you. when I was young growing up and my mom tried to feed me broccoli, I resisted it. And I would take a bite and I would spit it out and I hated it. I hated it. I hated it. What's interesting is today I eat broccoli all the time. And all that it took was someone to cook it with a new variety of
Sauce or
herbs and other things that gave it flavor. And suddenly it was like, oh, this is actually really good. But my mom would have told you back then, he will never choose to eat broccoli ever.
right.
He
It's
hates
inside
it
him.
so much because he hates it. And the reality is, I did turn to a point where I like it. It isn't the first thing I pick, but if it's offered to me, I will eat it, and I actually enjoy it.
Yep, I hear you.
So, Julianne, I just wanted to see if there was any questions or comments that came in over the from our viewers, or if you had some insightful question that you'd like to ask.
So I'm very curious for both of you, anecdotally, how much do you expect or think or predict generally for learners to say no during training? Are we hoping that it's very rarely? Would it be normal to see it all the time because then you just adjust and keep going? What's the frequency that we might expect to see no's from learners?
Let me give you my perspective on it. And a lot of it depends upon how familiar I am with that learner. The better you know your learner, the more likely you are to just intuitively set that learner up for success. And when I say intuitively, what that really means is your past history with that animal has told you, don't try this or this. This is more likely to work. And so you're not likely to see no's very often. Where I do see no's a lot is when you are trying a brand new concept that you've never trained before, that you're not really sure how to train. And sometimes you're making mistakes about how to ask for it. So the animal just looks at you and goes, I don't know what to do there, or says no. At other times, you're doing something that's too difficult for them. And so I find that it's in those kinds of situations where I might expect it to be a lot. But again, my cautionary tale is, as soon as you see the number of times they say no start to creep up, you better make some changes. There's a reason they're saying no as often as they are. And so to me, too many no's indicates how stubborn of a trainer I am, because I'm not making the changes that I need to make. And so you shouldn't see that many no's, because you should begin adapting pretty quickly. That's my approach.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it depends on the animal's behavioral history. If they come from a history of a lot of force and coercion, then saying no in a variety of ways, some more horrifying or dangerous than others, is going to be more likely. So it's truly a study of one. But ideally, hypothetically, if every training program is custom fit to the individual, given their genetics, their learning history, and current conditions, you would never see a no. So that's the high water mark.
Mm-hmm.
No means we've asked for something they're not prepared to do.
Yep.
And I would say I don't mind seeing a single no, as long as I'm able to adjust it. But a repeated no is probably not a good thing. So I think this is an interesting topic. So I'm not going to cut it off just yet. If there are any questions that you saw, Juliana, that came in that you think are worth answering, and for those of you watching, we may go about 5 minutes longer just to really wrap this topic up well.
I think Susan will have a great answer for this one. Isn't a learner's no also based on genetics? I have litter mates that I whelped. One is very outgoing and the other is afraid and says no a lot.
So I hear what you're saying, because we say the three sources of behavior are genetic tendencies, learning history, and current conditions. But the point that I'm working to make, it's not easy for me to make it though, so I appreciate the opportunity to do it better and better through repetition. What I'm saying is that even with a genetic tendency to be fearful, you have to ask the learner something they're afraid of responding to. So the environment is always influencing behavior, because behavior never occurs in a vacuum. If you never ask the fearful puppy to stride out beyond their limit, you would not get those no's. So I'm not advocating for that as a program. I'm just saying that behavior never occurs in a vacuum. Genetics is never the sole the sole engine of behavior. Wherever there are genes, there's always environment, and both are acting on that animal at all times. So the fact that one puppy will say no to one thing that another puppy doesn't say no to, we might say that that's their personality differences, their genetic tendency. But if you never ask the fearful puppy to do something fearful, they don't have anything to say no over. That's where we live. Our job is to change conditions to be effective with behavior. It's not to keep asking the fearful puppy over and over and over again. Yeah.
That's good.
This is a really interesting one. Are we always trying to change no's to yeses, or sometimes can't we learn to accept a no?
I love that. Go, Ken.
No, I was going to say, absolutely. We have to learn to accept a no. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we want to accept a no, particularly when it's putting an animal in danger or risky. I think when we're talking about trying to get an animal to yes, we are talking about when that is acceptable, or in general, you know that this particular species can do this quite with ease. You want to find a way to make it easy for the animal to do it. But if you've tried many different ways and you cannot find it, it may be that particular animal's no is definitive and we aren't going to keep going. I don't think we should, by any stretch of the imagination, keep trying until we get the yes. One of the things I love about guide dogs for the blind as they move to positive reinforcement is they do have what they call career change dogs. And the dogs get to a point where, for whatever reason, they have determined that they'll be a great guardian animal. They'll be great in something else, but they're just not cut out for guide dog work. And that's okay.
Yeah, that brings us to the tool for the job. And then, of course, Sai, your question makes me think of children. The skill to say no is one of the most protective skills we can give children, and the discriminations as they grow of when they can say no and when they can't say no, and how to work with that is really the high water mark of parenting, teaching, training. Absolutely. So that idea of changing behavior parens when change is necessary. It's not always necessary. And the skill to say no is very important to all of us. We just don't want it to be the majority of any animal's day, because that would indicate to me that's an ill-fit environment.
Right. Well said.
Love it.
All right.
Go
Any
on
other questions out there on this topic? We can go with one more.
Okay. Margaret asks, doesn't ending a session after an animal says no remove opportunity for reinforcement, so creates a cycle of losing both the initial behavior and their option to choose?
My answer is yes, absolutely. I don't think that when an animal says no, that the right answer is to automatically end the session. If the animal is enjoying the training, but just is not wanting to do this one thing, I would continue the session and do other things, do things that they enjoyed doing. I rarely find just ending a session because the animal's not doing well. Now, if the animal is frustrated with the training, then I think ending a session to manage that frustration is a smart thing to do. But I wouldn't, just because the animal said no this one time, doesn't mean we have to quit giving you opportunities for reinforcement, because I want that learning opportunity to always be engaging and fun for the animal.
Yeah, I agree completely. And you've really hit on, it's a very clever question, because you've hit on one of the reasons for not using positive punishment is that it is a double whammy. Not only does the animal have to experience the aversive stimulation being added, but they also are blocked from getting the reinforcer that was maintaining the behavior. So we have to track all of that. And that's why it's a profession. I say not every monkey can do it.
Yeah. I think it's telling that when you and I talked about you being on Live from the Ranch this time, you said to me, we need 2 hours, Ken. We can't do this in an hour. And I think that's absolutely true. But unfortunately,
We did our best.
I want to try to keep us within the time frame, and we are about 4 or 5 minutes over time. But I really appreciate you being here to discuss some of these hot and trending topics in the community. Juliana, I appreciate your input as well. I'm glad all of you who have been watching wrote in with questions. I'm so appreciative of that. And I want to remind all of you that we do have another episode coming up next month. During the month of June, our next guest is Ayoka Bubar, and Ayoka is a really skilled trainer and a great speaker. We're going to talk a little bit about rally obedience. It's one of the things that she loves talking about, and she will be my guest on June 6 p.m. Pacific time. I'm really looking forward, and want to remind you that if you have suggestions or ideas for other things that you'd like us to talk about, you're always welcome to put your comments in our comment section on the website, where it asks you for feedback of videos you'd like to show, speakers you'd like to see, trainers you'd like us to talk to. We're always open to your ideas. We love getting that feedback. And finally, just a final reminder of the offers and things that we talked about. If you're interested in becoming a professional dog trainer, you of course can look at our KPA dog trainer professional course. The magic is in the data. Coming up August 24th and 25th, Susan and I are going to join forces. She will be right here at the ranch, and we're going to have a lot of fun on that 2-day workshop. And then we also have our live classes, which we told you about. You can find out more about them by going to our website as well. Thanks all of you for joining us today. I really, really appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you next time on Live from the Ranch. Happy training. Bye-bye.